The religion and mythology of the Old Norse peoples are filled with gods, stories and sagas and heroes. We all know about Odin and Thor and all the other deities that are part of this pantheon. And in a previous episode, I've already talked about how people in this society are related to and maintain their relationship with these gods and deities and forces, mostly through different kinds of offerings and prayers. This took place both on a public scale in terms of Blut festivals and public offerings and prayers, but also more privately in the homestead and the family, where people would give offerings to the gods through statues and do other kinds of prayers. But aside from these mainstream practices, there was also a more mysterious aspect of Old Norse religion and society that was more so on the fringes of the society. This is what is known as Seidr, and was a kind of practice similar to the shamanistic rituals of the Siberian culture, associated with women who would walk around and perform practices that involved trance states and other kinds of altered states of consciousness, at least probably. Maybe we could even refer to this as a mystical practice, but we'll get back to whether or not that is an appropriate term. But so today I want to explore the fascinating and mysterious world of Seidr in Old Norse culture. The world of the Old Norse religions is a hard topic to get a firm grasp of due to the issues with sources that we talked about in my previous episode, as well as the fact that unlike religions like Islam and Christianity, which although they have of course changed in different ways over the centuries, are still practiced today, giving us direct examples of how things are done, this is not true to the same degree for Old Norse religions and its practice. Of course, there are various forms of neo-pagan revival movements which do involve practices like Seidr today, but they are reconstructed on the same shaky ground that we use as academics, so the same problem arises there too. And when it comes to Seidr in particular, things are even more murky, because it seems that this practice was surrounded by a kind of veil of secrecy. It was a very prominent aspect of Old Norse culture, but it seems to have been more on the margins of society and associated with a certain level of taboo. So what is Seidr then? I earlier mentioned the term mystical practice and mysticism. Is this a proper word? Well, this is difficult, right? Mysticism is a very problematic word. It's problematic even when we use it sometimes in the context of Christianity, which is probably where it's most appropriate, but it becomes even more inappropriate in a situation like this, which is a culture and religion that is completely different from that Christian context. So again, I shouldn't be using it unless, maybe we could define mysticism very broadly as involving any kind of altered state of consciousness. Maybe it could fit then. But that is one of the things that I want to do with this episode, is investigate whether or not we could call it a mystical practice, or if some other term or sort of categorization fit this practice better. Scholars are unsure of just how to define what Seidr is. Is it akin to sorcery or magic? Should it be lumped into the category of shamanism, for example? The word Seidr seems to etymologically mean something like to tie or bind. It's used as a noun, as in a practice referred to as Seidr, but it can also be used as a verb, as in to seid or att seida in Swedish. In the sources, it sometimes seems to refer to a particular practice similar to what is termed shamanism in other cultures, but in other places it seems to be used more broadly to refer to all kinds of sorcery or different ways of communicating with and affecting supernatural forces, almost as a term referring to a wide and diverse ritual complex. The archaeologist Neil Price says, quote, In one form or another, this concept is common to all the different magics reviewed above, but only in one of them is it made explicit: Seidr. As we've seen, although both Galdur and Gandur are also categorized in the written sources, the former was more a technique, while the latter seems to have referred mainly to a general kind of sorcerer's energy from which all powers was drawn. Again, when each or both of these are performed in conjunction with Seidr, there is never any doubt that the latter is the primary formative element in the ritual. In this specific sense, there are therefore grounds for discussing Seidr as a generic for Old Norse sorcery. Even though Seidr wasn't necessarily part of the wider, quote-unquote, mainstream public ritual practices of the Old Norse religion, it was strongly associated with some of the most prominent gods, namely Odin and Freyja. Odin was seen as the master of Seidr, and is perhaps most strongly associated with it. He is, of course, one of the most well-known of the deities in the Norse pantheon and is famous all around the world. And he's also one of the most fascinating and versatile of the gods. He famously has many different names and is a deity associated with a wide variety of different things, perhaps most prominently with war and warfare, but also both wisdom, poetry, ecstasy or trance-like states, and indeed Seidr, as well as things often associated with it, such as knowledge or the power of the runes. This role of Odin as the master of hidden wisdom, sorcery, and altered states of consciousness can be seen from many stories about him in the Eddic and Skaldic poetry. In the famous Havamal, there is the story about Odin hanging himself in the world tree, Yggdrasil, for 9 days, thereby receiving the wisdom and knowledge of runes and their mystical power, probably representing some kind of initiation leading to mystical insight. As we said, we also see the followers of Odin, his devotees, so to say, seeking out altered states of consciousness, trance-like ecstasies, and similar things in order to gain knowledge of inside and outside worlds. Some have indeed compared this to the Bacchic cult of Dionysus in ancient Greece, which had similar characteristics and practices. But Odin is not the only god known to be involved with these kinds of things. Indeed, the stories say that it was actually Freyja, the famous goddess of fertility, that taught Odin this art to begin with, and it was with the Vanir, the other group of gods aside from the Aesir, that it actually originated. Indeed, despite Odin's strong connection to it, on the ground, the actual practitioners of Seidr were almost exclusively women, making this connection to Freyja perhaps even more appropriate. And the fact that Freyja is associated with fertility, eroticism, and sex is reflected in the fact that the Seidr practices could often be quite intense and maybe even erotic and sexual in nature. So as we said earlier, Seidr is often used quite broadly as referring to a wider complex of practices, from divination to cursing people, soul traveling, and the altered states of consciousness that many associated with the term. We could complicate the topic even more by pointing out that there are other terms, such as Galdur, which comes from a word essentially meaning song or incantation, is also used for similar practices, sometimes basically interchangeably from Seidr, and at other times it seems to denote something more unique and different, albeit strongly connected still, of course. But in this episode, we're going to limit ourselves to the term Seidr as the umbrella term for all these different rituals and performances. So in actual practice, Seidr was very much associated with women and female practitioners. The performers of the Seidr ritual were known as a Volva, which means a staff bearer. In plural, it was volar. Again, staff bearers is what this seems to have meant, but there are also other terms like Seidkona, which means a Seidr woman, basically. Of course, this was a primarily male-dominated society, and women were pretty limited in their status and power. But the vulva was unique because she didn't fit into any of the normal roles that a woman or anyone really would typically have. She figured in a liminal state as a kind of ritual expert on the margins of society, both respected but also feared and sometimes looked down upon. The volar, which is the plural of vulva as we've said, would usually wander around and could be hired for their divinatory expertise. In such a case, the vulva would often visit the homestead or house of a family. A great feast would be prepared for her as a sign of respect, and then she would Seidr. In other words, perform the ritual of Seidr with all that entailed of going into a trance, etc., to be able to divinize the future, perhaps for a son in the family who wanted to be successful, or for a future marriage, or whatever the case may be. Of course, the news weren't necessarily always positive, but there seems to have been a kind of expectation for the vulva to sort of focus on the good part of her revelation, and this was one of the reasons for the great feast that you sort of gave to her. You gave gifts and payment to the vulva. If you didn't treat her with respect, she might give you bad news instead of good news, and you didn't want that. There are plenty of famous volar mentioned in the Old Norse sources. Probably most famously in the Völuspá, often the first poem in the Poetic Edda, which describes the whole duration of the world from its creation to its end in Ragnarok. And this whole poem takes the form of a story told by a vulva. Völuspá literally means something like the prophecy of the vulva, and it is thus such a woman that tells Odin of the fate of the world through her divinizing techniques. So what were those practices? How was Seidr actually performed? Well, the actual reliable sources don't give us much information, unfortunately, but there are certain stories and sagas from that period that do give us some hints of information. For example, there is Erik's Saga Rauda, the saga of Erik the Red, which seems to describe a kind of Seidr, at least parts of a Seidr performance, but particularly describes the vulva and her clothing and appearance in very significant ways. Just like we just talked about in Erik's Saga Rauda, it describes how this kind of Seidr would take place. The vulva would come to the homestead, there would be a great feast, and they would invite people from all over to come and have the vulva answer their questions and report things about their future. It seems to have been quite a spectacle, in other words, and involved certain aesthetic elements as well as various different objects and accoutrements that the vulva would use. When performing the ritual, the vulva seems to have been seated on a kind of heightened platform, referred to as a seidjallar. We aren't entirely sure what this looked like or how high it was, for example, but it is a recurring theme in all or many of these descriptions. There are descriptions involving two women falling off one of these seidjallar and breaking their backs as a result, indicating that it might, at least in some cases, have been a pretty high platform. The vulva also seems to have had a very distinct look to her, with paraphernalia related to the ritual itself. In the aforementioned Erik's Saga Rauda, she is described like this, quote, "Now when she came in the evening, accompanied by the man who had been sent to meet her, she was dressed in such wise that she had a blue mantle over her, with strings for the neck, and it was inlaid with gems quite down to the shirt. On her neck she had glass beads. On her head she had a black hood of lambskin lined with ermine. A staff she had in her hand with a knob thereon. It was ornamented with brass and inlaid with gems round about the knob. Around her she wore a girdle of soft hair or belt of touchwood, and therein was a large skin bag, in which she kept the talismans needful to her in her wisdom. She wore hairy calf-skin shoes over her feet, with long and strong-looking thongs to them, and great knobs of latten at the ends. On her hands she had gloves of ermine skin, and they were white and hairy within." One of the most prominent objects of the vulva was the staff, which seemed to have played a very important role in the ritual itself. Indeed, as we saw, the very word vulva means staff bearer, which indicates the very strong prominence of this object. There seems to have been different types of staffs, but that they serve a key role in the Seidr ritual, being used for divination in some way and for summoning spirits, perhaps. Staffs of different types are some of the most prominent objects found in the graves of Volva. Many scholars have also speculated that there might have been a sexual aspect to Seidr, and that the staff played an important role in that sense. The scholar Neil Price tackles this subject in his excellent book, The Viking Way, where he argues that Seidr might have involved sexual acts and performances, possibly of a masturbatory nature, and which would have involved this staff. These sexual aspects might have also been one of the reasons that there was such a strong stigma against male performers of the ritual, since being seen as effeminate was one of the worst things that you could experience as a man in this culture. There was a term for this at that time, ergi, which is basically a kind of insult against men accused of effeminate behavior, which was so serious that it could even result in being outlawed from society entirely. Men very rarely were associated with Seidr practice, and probably for this very reason, that it was associated with ergi. And if these ideas about a sexual side to the ritual are true, we might be able to see why. Many also believe that Seidr involved the Volva going into some kind of trance or altered state of consciousness in order to receive messages about the future or other hidden aspects of reality. And there are different ways that they are believed to have done so, one being, of course, music. Indeed, the use of a drum in Seidr is an often discussed theme, but is one that scholars very much disagree about. There is no direct, unquestionable reference to its use in the ritual, but several intriguing clues. Famously, in one of the poems of the Edda, the Lokasena, where Loki openly criticizes the other gods for their behavior, he, in one section, turns to Odin and says, "You beat on a vet like Volar." He disparagingly compares Odin to the Volar, which is the plural of Volva again, and says that, like them, he beats on a vet. Now, this word vet is what has puzzled scholars, because it is a word that isn't really used much at all in other sources, so we don't really know what it means. However, several people have argued that it might refer to a drum, thus being a reference to beating on a drum as part of the Seidr ritual. This might, however, be taking practices that we know to be common in other related cultures, like the Noidi of the Sami peoples or the shamanic practices in Siberia, and sort of projecting that onto Seidr when we really don't know for sure how connected they are. Needless to say then, other scholars have translated this part of the Lokasena in very different ways, which gives very different readings and meanings to this sentence. Beating on drums and singing songs, the latter of which certainly seems to have been part of the Seidr ritual, is often associated with trance states, ecstasy, or altered states of consciousness in general. This question, of course, becomes very key and relevant to whether or not the term mystical or mysticism can be applied here at all. Mysticism, as we've said, is of course a very highly contested and difficult term, but in our earlier video about mysticism in ancient Greece, we define it very loosely as that which concerns experiences of, practices related to, and explanations of direct encounters with the divine, usually accompanied by altered states of consciousness. Whether or not this fits into the Seidr practices of Old Norse religion is hard to say, especially given that we know so little about it. Again, if we compare these practices to those of related cultures in the Sami peoples and the wider circumpolar cultural sphere, altered states of consciousness in which one can commune with spirits, divine the future, soul travel, and have visions might have been a key aspect of Seidr. This seems, for example, to be hinted at in the 12th century poem Solarjod, where the Volva seems to have a vision after 9 days of sitting. Quote, "On the chair of the Nornir I sat 9 days, then I was raised up on a horse, the giantess's son shone grimly from the cloud dripper's clouds." There is also the possibility of the Volar using some types of intoxicants or other substances to induce the trance states that seem to have been core to the ritual. Again, there is very little actual evidence for this, but we have found both henbane and cannabis in Volar graves, indicating that they might have been used. Henbane in particular contains the compound scopolamine, which has a narcotic effect. Is all this just scholars making assumptions based on very little evidence? Well, maybe, but they are of course educated assumptions, and when we take into account the inevitable connection between Norse religious practice with its neighboring cultures, the evidence certainly seems to point in certain directions. So as you can tell, we don't know as much about Seidr as we would maybe like to. It's very much shrouded in a cloak of mystery. Even though we have certain sources that gives us hints, there is still a lot that we don't know, and we have to make educated guesses. Now, one thing that we can do to illuminate our understanding, maybe, is to compare the practice of Seidr to other seemingly similar practices in related cultures. So one of the things that a lot of scholars will discuss and debate about when it comes to Seidr is whether or not it can be considered part of the wider ritual complex known as shamanism, which is very prominent in Siberian cultures, for example, as well as the often termed shamanistic practices of the neighboring Sami peoples in northern Scandinavia. Many scholars have looked to the shamanistic and ritual practices of the Sami peoples living primarily in northern Scandinavia to find parallels with Seidr. It's widely known at this point that Sami peoples lived quite far south in places like Sweden and interacted on pretty deep levels with the rest of the population. Even more intriguing, there is some evidence that the kind of magic and power connected with Seidr and its practice was in some way actually associated with the Sami, even for the peoples in southern Sweden. A good example is in the Vansdela saga, where Seidr seems to be almost entirely associated with the Sami. In this text, the Sami are referred to as Finns. Quote, Ingjaldr returned home and invited many people to the feast. All those invited duly attended. Ingjaldr and his men prepared a Seidr performance in the old manner so that men could examine what the fates had in store for them. A Finn sorceress was among those present. The Finn woman sat on a high seat and was splendidly attired. Men left their benches and went forward to ask about their destinies. She predicted for each of them that which eventually came to pass, but each took the news in a different way. Aside from being very interesting for this so-called Sami connection, right, this text is also significant for giving a pretty detailed description of a Seidr ritual, at least from the perspective of the audience, so to say. Looking then at the Sami religion and its shamanistic practice, we can see some similarities. Very central to Sami society is the Noidi, a kind of shaman that would commune with spirits, perform divination and various types of healing both people and the environment generally. The Noidi would famously use a drum. He would chant and dance to induce a powerful altered state of consciousness where their soul would travel distances, commune with spirits, etc. And looking at the wider circumpolar region, we see practices that are related in different ways. From shamanism in certain Siberian cultures all the way to the Americas, there seems to be remnants of these types of rituals and worldviews. Now, we should keep in mind that linguistically and to some degree culturally, the Sami and quote-unquote Norse peoples weren't directly connected. The Norse came from a southern Germanic heritage, but they were certainly geographic neighbors, and as we've seen, they were in contact with each other in different ways. So it certainly isn't unthinkable that the shamanistic traditions of the Sami may have influenced or functioned within the same ritual framework as the Seidr complex. Nevertheless, Seidr is one of the most intriguing and fascinating aspects of Old Norse religion and culture. Can it be called mysticism? Probably not, unless we define that term very, very broadly as anything involving any kind of altered state of consciousness, at which point maybe it doesn't really mean anything. But Certainly if we go the route of comparing Seidr to similar practices in Sami culture or the wider shamanistic complex, we can get some really fascinating insights into the possible ways that one of the most interesting aspects of Old Norse culture and religion was indeed practiced. The Volva played a central role in this society, as we can see from their prominence in texts like the Voluspa and the Poetic Edda, and their practices of divination can not only fascinate but also remind us of other similar practices across the world, from the practices of the Sami peoples up north all the way to the oracle at Delphi in ancient Greece. I'll see you next time.